Hello, everybody, and welcome to the business case for high performance buildings. This roughly 2-hour webinar will be a discussion of what makes a building high performance and why that is useful to you all as brokers in your day-to-day business interactions. My name is Emily McLaughlin. I work with the Institute for Market Transformation. This course is part of a larger Department of Energy grant, and to date, roughly about 400 brokers have been educated with this course. So it is a pretty long-running program and pretty worthwhile. So hopefully you all will get something that you can take back to your day-to-day interactions and learn more about these high-performance buildings and integrate them into your portfolios. Before we get started, just some housekeeping disclaimers. High-performance building will be the term that we use most frequently during this discussion. But some synonyms and words that you may hear me use are also green, energy aligned, or something of the like. So high performance green, energy aligned, those are all going to be synonyms for the sake of this discussion. So why do these high performance buildings matter? If you look at the total energy consumption of buildings in general, we're looking at 40%. When you break that down and you look at high performance buildings, you realize that they have a nearly 30% increase in net operating income per square foot. Additionally, they have a roughly 18% reduction in operating expenses per square foot when compared to their traditional non-green buildings. So obviously the numbers are here as to why these high performance buildings matter. And this course is really going to break down the elements of why those are important, and we will discuss logistics and characteristics and dig into all the elements of what makes a building high performing. When we lead this course, we frequently get typical questions, and these are the ones that you're seeing on your screen. So do these buildings matter? Are they worth it? Do they make money? These are all normal and realistic questions that we hear from brokers while we lead this course. And the answer is yes. The short answer is yes, these buildings do matter. They do make money. They are worthwhile. And hopefully this course will give you an introduction into why these should be first and foremost in your portfolio integration and why you should be aware of these buildings and what make these buildings high performance. So when LEED started a couple decades ago, and even 10, 15 years ago, LEED may have been just something that was nice for brokers to consider. It wasn't necessarily at the forefront of their negotiations and in their portfolios. But today, LEED is almost a necessity that brokers are aware of. And if you're not integrating LEED and Energy Star into your interactions, you're really operating at a disadvantage. So hopefully this course will break down a little bit more and set you all up so that you are more confident to talk about these buildings. So what is this course really about? It's really about the bottom line. It's really about net operating income, or NOI. Obviously, NOI is the bottom line for real estate investors. NOI is really what makes the business go around. But what we really hope this course informs you on, and what you take away from it, is that there's a lot more to NOI than just rental rates. And more so than that, what we really want to show is that high-performance buildings can factor into every single one of these categories that you're looking at. So vacancy rates, operating expenses, mortgage interest rates, these are all factors that high performance buildings can positively affect. So this is just a quick agenda, just outlining some of the points that we will be highlighting over the next couple hours. You'll see interspersed in here, we do have case studies. There will be discussions of real buildings that have gone through renovations, or they have retrofitted a previously low-performing, inefficient building, and they have been retrofitted into a much more efficient and high-performing building. So we will go into real examples of all of those, as well as break down some of the more technical side of what makes a building high performance. So here we have a pretty pretty complicated, somewhat overwhelming graph that explains where the value is in green buildings. As you can see from it, if you take away anything from this particular side, you have developer, tenant, and owner, and they're all getting benefits from buildings being more green or more efficient. But I've broken this down to make this a little bit more palatable and so that we can dig into this graphic a little bit more and understand it from a pretty high level. So we're going to take developer first. If you're following along by color, developer I have labeled as blue, we have owner red, and then you're going to see some of the crossover colors for areas that apply to more than one sector, so developer, tenant, or owner. When you're looking at the developer, sale prices are obviously front of mind for developers, as well as lower design and construction costs, all things that affect their bottom line. They want a higher sale price, they want design that can come in at a lower cost. All of those things also factor in with being able to sell their building quicker. What we're going to show you a little bit more in detail as we go on is that all of these goals, so the higher sale price, quicker sales, all of these are characteristics that we see in high-performing buildings. When you dig into the financials a little bit more, you see that there is more of an ability to secure finance as well as a rapid return on that investment. Again, all of these factor into the overall bottom line, finance dollars being what these developers are really pushing for when they are navigating their portfolio of buildings. Furthermore, we have lower refurbishment costs, and this factors in really for multiple of these sectors, developer, owner, tenant, because if you don't have to refurbish the building as frequently or at as expensive of a price tag, obviously that's a win-win for everybody in the situation. The last component that we have here is more about corporate image and prestige, as well as CSR, corporate social responsibility. This is something that we are increasingly seeing in the market. It is a trend that is not going away. In a few slides from now, we'll dig into CSR and corporate reporting in a little bit more detail. But these are all things that a lot of parties involved in high-performance buildings can use as a selling point. So a developer would be able to say that they have X number of high-performing or green buildings in their portfolio, just like a tenant would be able to say, look, we lease space in X number of high-performing buildings, or our building is LEED Platinum or LEED Gold or whatever it is. So this is a selling point for not just the developer. When you look at the tenant side, we're really looking at a lot of productivity and increased well-being. So increasingly, the market is more interested in and putting a lot of emphasis on the well-being of the tenants in the building. So a lot of what we talk about are the characteristics of the building. During this webinar, we're going to discuss what makes a building high-performing, but increasingly, we're seeing that those high-performing buildings have a higher increased productivity for the tenants who are working or living in them. And this, as I said, is increasingly something that the market is realizing is important for a lot of different parties. Again, we see this corporate image and prestige, lower refurbishment costs. Those also factor in for the tenant. Last on the bottom there, we have reduced downtime and lower O&M costs. So obviously, those are huge for tenants. If they have less downtime, they can move into their space quicker. They have less O&M that they have to factor in. Again, bottom line, it's dollars when we're looking at this from a simplistic standpoint. Last on this bubble of the Venn diagram, we have owner. So as you can see, we have that those financial factors in blue again, so ability to secure finance, rapid return on investment, as well as, again, the reduced downtime, lower O&M costs, and again, the refurbishment corporate image. What you're seeing new here is slower depreciation and lower exit yield, as well as increased occupancy rates. These are all things that owners of buildings have to deal with on a regular basis. If tenants are leaving at a slower rate and there's less turnover, obviously that factors in positively for the owner. These high performance buildings also tend to be have a slower depreciation rate. They are generally more, their longevity is much higher than a traditional building. So bringing these all back together, clearly you can see that all parties involved in the life cycle of a building, developer, tenant, owner, they're all getting positive payback from operating in a green or high-performing building. It's not just the building owner, it's not just the building developer. Every single party, tenants included, is getting positive payback from these buildings. All right, so we are going to dig into Energy Star and LEED 101. Some of you may be relatively familiar with LEED and Energy Star, and some of you this may be a new topic, and maybe some of you fall somewhere in the middle. But really, we're increasingly seeing that brokers have to be at least baseline educated on what makes a building high performing. And LEED and Energy Star are two leading certifications in the industry that you should definitely be familiar with and feel comfortable talking about with your clients. So on the left, you'll see a breakdown of LEED, and on the right, you have Energy Star. LEED is really about the building construction, and there's multiple certification types, as you can see. This really goes into how the building was built and what makes it the level of high performance that it has been granted. So silver, gold, platinum, whatever it may be. It's really a building standard and something that we are increasingly seeing more parties interested in. So, 10, 15 years ago, low VOC paint may not have been the norm necessarily. But today, it's almost a given, and you see most manufacturers offering low VOC paints right off the bat. It's not something that is confusing or unheard of in the industry. One of the most important things too about LEED is that we're now looking at a decade and a half plus of case studies and justifications for why these buildings are worthwhile and why you should be factoring them in. And as obviously goes with time, the cost premium has gone down, so that is a positive for LEED in general. On the right, when you look at Energy Star is really, or portfolio manager that is one of Energy Star's main tools, gives you a snapshot of buildings. So Energy Star, when you go on and you input the information for a building into Portfolio Manager, it's going to spit back out a number between 1 and 100 for most buildings. 100 is obviously the best, 1 not so much. Buildings that are rated 75 or higher can be labeled or can be eligible to be labeled for Energy Star. Energy Star, if you are thinking about benchmarking as something that either your city requires you to factor in or you're using it as your own baseline comparison, Energy Star is really going to be the go-to tool for benchmarking. And we're seeing increasingly cities are moving towards benchmarking as a mandate or as a recommendation or guideline. So when you hear about those, Energy Star is going to be first and foremost in that discussion. So really what this all breaks down to is why does this all matter for the occupants of the building? You all have probably heard the 330-300 rule about operating expenses and price per square foot and productivity. And really what this all breaks down to is that these high performance buildings factor into tenant satisfaction and tenant efficiency and productivity. We're seeing these buildings have components such as better daylight. There are more windows. Natural daylight affects workers in a positive way. They tend to be more productive. What this really all factors into is that the business case is there for putting more money into a building and making it more efficient and better performing, you're not just getting the benefit from the building itself, but you're also passing that benefit off to the occupants or the tenants of the building. Additionally, there are increasingly more certification programs these days that are looking at not just the building and the efficiency of it, but also how that factors into tenant satisfaction and occupant satisfaction and productivity. Um, some examples of that is we have Fitwell and Well, and these are all certifications that are increasingly becoming popular. Fitwell is a great example. It's a partnership with the Center for Active Design, and it is particularly looking at what makes a building the highest level of, or to get to the highest level of employee, tenant, productivity, well-being. Things like walk score are factored in, things like is there a cafeteria with access to healthy food, natural daylight. These are all factors that previously were not considered or not considered as much, but we're seeing them more and more, and the market is responding to what occupants and tenants are saying is important to them. So here we have an example of how increasingly popular Energy Star is. So if you look way on the left, you have 1999, tiny, tiny number of cumulative Energy Star certified properties. If you go to 2012 and the last statistics we have available, you have exponentially increased. I mean, we're looking at over 20,000 certified properties. So clearly the upward trend is there. The market is telling us that Energy Star is increasing in popularity. For you all as brokers, this is really important to keep in mind and to remember that Energy Star is a trend that's not going away. It's been here for a while, but even just in the last decade or so, it has rapidly increased. So you might think that LEED and Energy Star are more common, or you see them more in certain areas of the country. What these next few slides will hope to show you is that they're not, this isn't just the big cities, this isn't just the East Coast, the West Coast, whatever it may be. LEED and Energy Star are everywhere. They're all over the country. It doesn't matter where you are. The first map that we have here is Atlanta, Georgia. So here there's over 1,000 high performance buildings. So that's LEED and Energy Star. And you can see, if you look at the breakdown on the map, they're really all over. There's even some that are on the outskirts of the city. And here we have Omaha, Nebraska. So Atlanta, large metropolitan area on the East Coast, and then you have Omaha, Nebraska, Midwestern state, landlocked, not, or Midwestern city, landlocked, not somewhere that you may right off the top of your head think of as a hotbed for high performance buildings, but that's actually not true. There's over 300 high performance buildings there, and actually they are increasing every month. In the month of September 2017, the city of Omaha added 3 more high performance buildings in just September alone. So they're not going away, and even smaller cities and Midwestern cities, they're definitely prevalent. To give you an example further, in the city of Omaha, increasing Energy Star certification. So you can see from this map, if you look at 2004, we were down below 80, and now we're hovering right about at 90, give or take a few average points there. But there's an upward trend. There's a distinct upward trend of Energy Star buildings. And lastly, we're going to look at Seattle, Washington. So somewhere that you may think has more sustainability initiatives or energy efficiency or something of the like. And there are a lot of high performance buildings there. There are close to 1,200 high performance buildings there. And again, they're spread all over. But this number is roughly in line with what you see for some other major metropolitan areas. So what I hope you take away from those graphs is really it doesn't matter where you are in the country. It doesn't matter if it's a small city in the Midwest, East Coast, West Coast. These buildings are increasing in popularity and they're not going away. And this is just one last breakdown of Seattle. This is LEED certification specifically. As you can see, close to half of the LEED certified buildings in Seattle specifically are LEED Gold. So that's a pretty substantial number as well. That it's not silver, it's not just certified buildings. They are actually LEED Gold, one step down from platinum. All right, so now we are going to break down some real world examples. So how does this actually look in the real world? I mean, we've looked at national cities across the country, we've looked at national statistics, but what does this really look like? So this actually more so than national, this actually is even international here. So this is a case study by Bental Kennedy. And what they did was they did a longitudinal study of it was over 100 buildings within their portfolio. And just to break down some statistics for you here, the North American and European real estate sector consumes 81% of total electricity. So 81% of total electricity consumption can be targeted to the real estate sector. I mean, that's a huge percentage. Anytime you're talking about 81% of anything, but anything that the market is telling you, any 81% of the market is massive and definitely shouldn't be ignored. But what the biggest takeaway from this case study is how these high-performing buildings really factor in positively for the tenants and the owners and developers and whatnot. But the tenant satisfaction in BOMA best buildings compared to traditional buildings was 20% higher. When you're looking at LEED buildings, you're looking at a 10% higher, and that's roughly in line with Energy Star as well for occupancy rates. So 20%, 10% may not sound like huge percentages, but as a broker, if you take your portfolio, if you can have a 20% higher satisfaction for just 20% of your portfolio, higher satisfaction for 20% of your portfolio, that would take a whole lot off your plate. And if that means that 20% of your transactions are easier and factor into longer term agreements, that's a win-win. So what we're seeing is there's really, really higher satisfaction across the board from these high-performing and green buildings. Here we have a couple quotes that were pulled specifically from this case study. As you can see, commercial office buildings that have energy efficient labels tend to factor into higher sale prices. More so than that, energy efficiency and default risk have been shown to have a negative correlation. Obviously, default is a huge concern for everybody in the market, in the sector, and if you can do anything to show a negative correlation and decrease your risk of default, obviously you're going to want to learn more about that and see how you can factor that into your portfolio. So just some more information about how there is not only an interest and an increasing trend in these high-performing buildings, but we're seeing rental premiums of these high-performance commercial, specifically, buildings. So as you can see, all of the research is really pointing in the same direction. There's a rental premium. These buildings are important. They bring in more money, and they are worth your time. They are definitely worth your time. All right, so now we're going to break down a little bit more about what is actually driving the market to make these changes, or what are the factors that the market is showing us? So we mentioned earlier about CSR and corporate prestige and corporate image, and this graph is really a visualization of just that. So what this is showing is S&P 500 companies and their level of sustainability reporting. If you look on the left, you have 2011, when we have 80%, the vast majority of these S&P 500 companies were not reporting. Fast forward 5 years, and you've now more than flipped that statistic. So we now have 82% of S&P 500 companies that are reporting. 5 years may seem like a long time, but in the scheme of market trends, 5 years is the blink of an eye. And for this trend to have more than flipped is pretty significant and definitely a substantial statistic to pay attention to in your day-to-day business interactions. So here we have a few reporting mechanisms. So we have 4 reporting mechanisms. We're going to break down a little bit more into GRESB in a moment, which is one of the notably larger reporting mechanisms. But these are all companies that I would recommend looking into if you are interested or your clients are interested in sustainability reporting. So this is a snapshot of GRESB and how widespread and important it is. If you take a moment to look at the numbers here and the coverage that GRESB hits, it's pretty substantial. Arguably, GRESB is the foremost reporting tool. So if you are not familiar with GRESB, I would definitely take a look at it and learn a little bit more about it. Us here at IMT, we frequently work with companies who are going through the GRESB reporting cycle, and we can tell you from experience that these companies take their GRESB reports incredibly seriously. We frequently see them go dark for a few weeks when they need to finish up their GRESB reporting. It's a pretty comprehensive report, but it's justifiably so. It gives the companies who are submitting the reports a pretty overarching look at a number of different factors. So definitely look into it. GRESB is a name you should know and you should be familiar with for either your own company or your clients. So we talked about national, we talked about local, we talked about across the country. This is just a snapshot of international. We have the rate of sustainability reporting across these various regions for the 100 largest companies. So as you can see, again, this is an increasing trend. These reporting is not going away. Sustainability reporting is something that we are increasingly seeing. And as brokers, you definitely need to be aware of what components go into those reports and what makes them important. All right, so the second driver is technology. I don't have to tell you that you probably have sat through a dozen plus conference presentations, seminars, webinars, whatever it may be, that discuss how technology is changing your industry and your market. Well, real estate's no different. Real estate is incredibly impacted by technology, as is energy efficiency and sustainability. If you look on the left, this is an example of a submeter. Submeters are an increasingly popular tool that allow the users a much clearer picture of what their energy usage is. And without that clear picture, you can't really make educated decisions about changes you should make in your building. So by knowing the amount of energy that you're using, you set yourself up in a much more educated position to be able to know what is going to be the best changes for your building specifically. More so than the building-specific technology, so more so than things like sub-meters, technology is also changing the way we interact. So again, that probably goes without saying. You don't need a webinar to tell you that, but technology is changing how we're interacting with the clients, with the tenants, with the partners and utilities. People are demanding technology and data transparency is increasingly a phrase and an expression that we hear. People want more data. They want to know what their data is. They want to know, for example, how much energy they're using. These are trends that we can all attribute back to technology, and they're not going away. To give you an example of a real world application of how technology has gone from pretty large and somewhat complex to pretty palatable and manageable. In the spring of 2017, the Department of Energy awarded a company called Maison who designed sub-meters. And this sub-meter is not a large, takes up half your wall in your utility space. This is a arguably tiny sub-meter, and that is smaller than a can of soda. So technology is not only getting cheaper, as we see, it's getting more efficient, and it's getting more realistic and more plausible. So a little bit more about why sub-metering is something that you should be aware of. It really makes it easier for the landlords to benchmark all of the tenants' the building's tenants' consumption. And if they need to comply with regulations, either landlord-specific, city-specific, whoever regulations may be passed down from, sub-metering makes this much easier. Additionally, you have the luxury then to charge tenants based on their actual use rather than just a pro rata share or a baseline amount that every month is the same. As I said a minute ago, actual data really improves these relationships across the board. It improves building management, and it creates opportunities to seek out additional services, and more so than that, know what additional services you might need. If you don't know how much energy your building is using, you don't really know where to look. You're going to go into that conversation uneducated if you don't have the data and the facts backing you up. So what does this all mean for brokers? Really what it comes down to is leadership opportunity and competitive edge. As brokers, if you are able to knowledgeably and confidently talk about these high performance building characteristics with your clients, it sets you up in a much more competitive position than the broker next to you. Obviously, something you all are very sensitive to is the amenities of the building. All of these characteristics that we have talked about and will talk about much later when we dig into the specifics of a building can be labeled as amenities. Obviously, amenities, amenities, amenities. These are what you hear from clients who are considering buildings. To give you an example of this, here at IMT, a few years ago when we were looking for a new space to move into, we vetted a whole number of brokers. We knew exactly the type of broker or the type of knowledge we wanted that broker to have. We knew what we were looking for. More so than that, once we found a broker, we had to guide them in a direction because we knew we wanted things like more daylight. We didn't want some of the office to have to be in a corner in a cube farm. We wanted daylight to be very accessible and very visible to everybody. We wanted things like a bike room with a shower so that our employees who bike to work can come in, lock their bike up, shower, and get to work. These are all things that you may not see in a traditional non-high performing building. You frequently see a lot of these higher end luxuries, if you will, or luxury amenities put into high performing buildings. They're attracting premiums for the, tenants who are interested in paying these premiums because these amenities are important to them will be attracted to these buildings. And again, that pays off in the end for all the parties. To tell you the end of IMT's story, basically, after a pretty in-depth search for the appropriate broker and the appropriate building, we did end up signing a lease. We are incredibly happy at our current space. More so than that, in the last year or so, we have had to renegotiate our lease. So we came to the end of that initial lease. And because we were so happy in our space, we re-upped for a longer term. And we now have a pretty penny to be able to make some other retrofits and upgrades to our space that will meet our employees' needs. So happy ending all around. It's something that we put in the time and effort up front to be able to seek out not only a broker, but also a building that was going to meet all of our needs. So I really encourage you all, as you are interacting with your clients, to factor these in, factor these high performance amenities in. If they don't ask for them specifically, throw it out there and ask them if they're interested in it. Frequently, they will lend to higher rental prices, higher yields all around. So what does this mean big scale? When you think about trends, government, private corporations, these are all trendsetters, if you will, when you talk about market changes. When you think about the GSA specifically, the GSA is actually the largest civilian tenant in the entire country. You actually have DOD that is the largest tenant, but GSA, we're looking at civilian tenant. If the GSA is doing something, if the federal government is making a decision, you can be pretty confident that it's going to trickle down at least somewhat quickly to the private sector, to NGOs, to corporations, that it's going to trickle down and you're going to see whatever trend they were pushing, you're going to see that come up in other sectors as well. So George Bush actually signed an executive order while he was president that stated that any federal leases for more than 10,000 square feet had to be Energy Star certified. Regardless of your politics, regardless of what side of the aisle you fall on, this is really about money. This isn't about politics. It isn't even about sustainability. President Bush realized that this was a business proposition, that he was going to be saving the federal government a lot of money down the line. So again, politics aside, even sustainability aside, I mean, this is a business proposition. George Bush realized that the dollars were there and the statistics were there, and so he went forward with it, and today we still see that. So what exactly makes a high-performance building more valuable? We're going to break down a few more of the statistics, and we're also going to get into a few case studies up ahead. So taking a deeper dive into the numbers here. If you are a numbers person, you probably love this slide, or if you are a statistics or equations person. I am not. However, you can break this down in a really simplistic manner. If you look at over on the right, I use that column on the right as really a simplistic way to look at the equations on the left. So obviously there's no numbers here, but the equations on the left, you can visualize putting in building numbers, realistic numbers into those equations. But if you're looking at gross revenue, so higher rents, thinking about high performance buildings and all of this, but you have lower vacancy versus the rest of the market. So gross revenue minus vacancy equals effective revenue, revenue goes up. The numbers are all here. When you look at the operating side of things, high performance buildings statistically have lower operating expenses, lower utility bills, lower maintenance. These are all things that factor into every high performance building. Well, obviously, if you have lower operating expenses, your NOI goes up significantly. If you're spending less on the day-to-day maintenance and foundational expenses, your NOI can go up. What I really hope you take away from this is that even if it feels like some of these factors of a high performance building don't necessarily factor into every one of these categories. For example, you may not think of high performance buildings in vacancy rate, but they do, and high performance buildings tend to have a lower vacancy rate. So instead of thinking of the big picture, which can oftentimes get muddy and confusing if you're new to this um, understanding of high performance buildings, really look at each of the components that makes up the financial image or outlook of a building. So look at gross revenue, look at vacancy, look at operating expenses. These are all factors that high performance buildings can help with, and I hope to show you down the line that the numbers are there. So here we have some energy savings, some hypothetical energy savings broken down. You can look on the left, you have baseline comparison, but then you have energy saved 5, 10, 15, 25%. What you're looking at all the way over on the left is not just what the savings are per square foot, that's the column in the middle, but what the actual value translates to. So let's just take it down to the extreme. If you can manage to save 25% of energy in comparison to baseline, you have increased the value per square foot by almost $8. That's a pretty insane amount per square foot. If you take it down to a lower percentage, you have, let's say, 5% energy savings. What that actually translates to for value per square foot is $1.50. For anybody who's particularly interested in cap rates, or they are keen on learning all or factoring in cap rates, this is based on an 8% cap rate. So here we have another snapshot case study from Liberty Property Trust. So this is really a snapshot of Liberty Property Trust portfolio. As you can see, it is all across the country. There are spaces in Pennsylvania, in Florida, in Arizona. I mean, this is not just one region or one area of the country. It breaks down what the square foot of those buildings are. So obviously we have some fairly substantially large buildings, and then we have some smaller buildings, smallest of which I think we have, let's see, yeah, we have 50,000 square feet roughly is one of the smaller buildings on here. You also have what the energy cost savings per square foot are, but what's really important, what the takeaway from this is if you look down on annual cost savings, that column all the way on the right, every single one of these buildings has multiple thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars of savings. So when you break down what they are actually saving or what they've done and what that's factored into energy cost savings, and you look at the actual dollar amount, it's pretty substantial. So take a moment to look at some of these statistics, and I will tell you that one frequent question we hear at this point is, well, what was done in these actual buildings? What was done so that they could get to that $200,000 annual cost savings? And we'll get into that. We will get into specifically how buildings can make changes, specific changes that they can make so that they can get to some of these pretty significant cost savings. So another financial statistical breakdown that we have, this one is from JLL, and what I really want to draw your attention to is a couple things. You have obviously the annual savings, 35 grand. That's after only a $100,000 investment. What that's going to factor into is one, a pretty short, simple payback period. So we're looking at just about 3 years of payback, which is in the grand scheme of a long commercial lease, if you have a 10, 15-year lease, 3 years is a drop in the bucket. But you also have a 35% ROI. More so than that, we have breakdown here of internal rate of return, and that's 10 and 5 year, both of which are substantially into the 20s and 30s percentage points. What You should also take away from this breakdown here, and what those question marks at the bottom are insinuating. JLL really factors in energy savings for their entire portfolio. So the amount that's saved and what each of their buildings looks like will really depend on a number of factors. So are there tax credits available? What's the depreciation? Are there utility incentives they can get? Uh, what is the tenant pass-through clauses look like? What is the agreement there? Does the landlord agree to pass through any of the capital expenses? So these are all things that are building specific. But what I hope you take away is that it's not one size fits all, but there are going to be substantial savings if you're factoring in all the different availability, energy efficiency upgrades that are available. So the next case study we have here is actually in North Carolina. So this is a nonprofit organization called the SelfHelp Credit Union. It's over 40,000 square foot building. It's a mixed use office, and it is in Wilmington, North Carolina, so over towards the coast if you know North Carolina at all. Now, they were operating under full service gross leases, and we will get into some of the more nitty-gritty of that in a moment. But this is a snapshot of what the building we are working with is. And here we have some of the building improvements that they made. So what I want you to take away here is that this was not that somebody came in, did an energy audit, and there was, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of dollars worth of energy improvements that could have been made. It was a strategic, systematic decision on the part of the building owners to make progressive changes. So in 2012, they have new building management system put in. The BMS obviously is the backbone, the core of the building. If you have a highly efficient and useful BMS, you're setting yourself up for a much stronger core and backbone of the building. And a lot of the other energy improvements that you make will be easier down the line, and it'll be easier to maintain and operate all of them. A year later in 2013, they put a new chiller in. Both of those, a BMS and a chiller, are pretty substantially expensive upgrades, but they didn't do them all at once. This wasn't a one and done upgrade. It wasn't they came in and exhausted their budget and did everything they possibly could. They did them slowly, and that's fine too. That's definitely something that can be considered, and any improvement that you are making will help your bottom line in some capacity. Those were some of the improvements that they made for the overall building, but they also did some smaller upgrades for tenant spaces, so tenant-facing improvements. They had new perimeter heating units, and they also had high-efficiency fluorescent lamps as well as LED exit signs. So little things, but little things that all factored into the overall tenant satisfaction as well as the bottom line of the space and getting a return on investment. So if you're a numbers person, here's your slide. This breaks down what their EUI was previously, or in 2012, 2013, and what that improvement looked like. It also shows you that their Energy Star score in 2012 was just above 60. So if you remember from the first slides of this webinar, we noted that 75 and higher in Energy Star could be certified as Energy Star labeled. So 62, that put them well below that. However, in 2013, they were now at 84, and they were well above that. 35% improvement that represents. But if taking it down to what the actual annual energy savings were, we're looking at over $11,000 in annual energy savings. IRR looks into almost 30%. So these are pretty substantial numbers. If you want to break that down even further, or take the outlook to a long-term scope, the value that was added to the building's potential sale price is over $200,000, factoring it at a 5.5% cap rate. Overall, pretty substantial. This was not an unfeasible upgrade, not something that they were taking a building from the bare bones and updating every last element of it, but they were still factoring in tens of thousands of dollars in annual energy savings. So pretty substantial and for only a handful of upgrades. So now we're going to actually break down into what are some of the common building upgrades. So on this first slide, we have some of the more not one and done, but ones that can be factored in continually and don't necessarily require a whole lot of upfront costs. Retrocommissioning is an example of something that can be ongoing and should be ongoing. The payback is incredibly quickly. It's a very, very fast payback. It's less than 1 year. When you're retrocommissioning your equipment, so your HVAC, whatever it is, you're setting yourself up to be, for your machinery and your equipment to be operating more efficiently longer term. So if you just install an HVAC and the next time it gets service is when it dies, you're really operating at a loss. You have missed some opportunity to make that equipment much more efficient. By retrocommissioning periodically, you're setting yourself up for a win-win situation. You then no longer have to replace that technology as frequently. Energy efficient window film, again, relatively cheap upgrade, not something that takes a whole heavy lift to install, and we're looking at a 3 to 10% energy use saving. Low flow water fixtures are a great example of something that has a short payback period, again, less than 1 year, and is not terribly difficult to install. So here we have lighting. You probably are familiar with some of these. Maybe you're familiar with LED exit signs. Lighting retrofits are a pretty common one. But again, lighting is a great way to get a pretty quick payback. So all of these are looking at 1 to 2+ years, depending on what the technology is. Cost will vary depending on what you're putting in. But if you look at the cost per installation. So for lighting retrofits, we're talking 65 cents to $1 per square foot. Yes, sure, that would add up, but not particularly pricey in the grand scheme of things. Exit signs, $20 per sign plus installation, labor installation, but you're probably, unless you're looking at a very, very large building, you're not looking at dozens and dozens and dozens of these exit signs. Lighting controls, this cost will vary pretty significantly depending on what the system you are putting in place is, but what's really important here is that it can reduce your lighting use by 15 to 20%. This really gets at the behavior change of energy efficiency. So you can build a LEED and Energy Star building and put in all this great technology when you're building the building, but if you're not thinking about how behavior factors into the bottom line, you're really missing out and you're missing an opportunity. Lighting controls can take the guesswork out of, well, did my employees turn off the lights? It's 9 o'clock, we're not there anymore. We should really not have the HVAC running at full force. These are all examples of how this technology and these controls really factor into a pretty high energy savings. And one more note on this too, when we're talking about lighting retrofits, if your building is one that is still using T8s or T12s, I would really recommend looking into upgrades for those, as those are pretty inefficient technology, and that's something that can be done pretty quickly. So now we're getting into some of the more expensive options for energy conservation measures. Green roofs. Green roofs are, you're increasingly hearing about them in the news. They are components that could be a pretty big selling point depending on what the market you're operating in is. But they do have a longer payback. So we're looking at 5 to 7 years. We're looking at about $18 per square foot for installation, replacement, maintenance, things like that. But I mean, there's $19, almost $20 per square foot in energy and stormwater savings. So they are an incredibly sustainable option, but you are looking at a more upfront cost as well as ongoing maintenance of them. And building controls. This is what we were talking about a minute ago with lighting controls, but there are increasingly systems that can operate and maintain your control levels of things like your HVAC. Again, with lighting, I mean, these are all elements that can be controlled from afar these days and with a system. So if something runs awry, or there is a concern, or there is an electrical surge, whatever it is, these are all things that technology is increasingly getting at, and can help you save money and save energy. You're looking at about $2 per square foot for those. Payback can be pretty quick. It could be less than 2 years, but you're looking at 20 to 40%, 40 cents per square foot savings in utility costs. Energy Star appliances is another relatively easy to accomplish upgrade. It's not something that requires a whole big heavy lift, but Energy Star appliances payback is usually 2 to 3 years. There is a cost premium, so you can just go to any Home Depot and walk down and look at the washer and dryers and realize that there is a cost premium associated. However, you do need to factor in that there's a 10 to 50% energy savings. So they could use potentially up to half the amount of energy that a traditional unit was using. All right, so solar. Solar tends to be a hot ticket item. You hear about it in the news. You hear all sorts of stories about solar. Rooftop solar, as in purchase, so cash purchase, is one option. But there are also other options such as a PPA, so a power purchase agreement, or even a lease. What you should take away from this slide is that solar is not one size fits all. It's not a one and done. It's not something that there's only one option. So when solar first came out, it may have been a matter of, well, you have to buy the panels, and once you buy the panels, that's that, and you can get the savings. That's not how it is anymore. You can still do that. You can still purchase solar, rooftop solar, install it. You're looking at 70% energy savings, but you're looking at a pretty long payback period. So you're looking at 10 to 15 years. On the other side of that, you have PPA. So PPA requires no upfront capital cost, and there's usually a fixed utility rate, so it mitigates the risk of rising electricity costs. More so than that, we have rooftop solar leasing. So much like manner that you lease anything else, again, little to no upfront capital cost, and you're still getting the benefits of energy bill reduction, but you don't own it, and there's not as much of a risk mitigation as there is with a PPA. But all options depending on what scenario you're in and what you're looking for. So, as we said, there's a lot of ways you can do solar. This is a case study, an example of how one retailer chose to do solar, and they chose a PPA. So this is a case study from Regency Centers, looking at a Trader Joe's store. So Regency and Trader Joe's entered into a PPA agreement. So what that means is it's landlord-owned solar. What that factored into for Trader Joe's was a 65% reduction in energy use. So the retailer's saving money, they have access to clean power, and they're able to meet 65% of their energy needs. The benefit is that they, being Trader Joe's, is working with the landlord The landlord owns and installs and maintains these solar panels, so Trader Joe's is not on the hook for that. They are then receiving the electricity at a fixed rate, so they have mitigated their risk against any rising costs that may come up in the future. To break this down by numbers, what we're looking at is over 50,000 square foot solar PV system. It was an 11,000 square foot store, and it was, you can see this broken down, it's roughly $1 million total investment by Regency. But one huge benefit of that is 3.6 million pounds of carbon dioxide emissions were avoided. That's pretty huge since 2011. And this study is a couple years old at this point too, so that number will have increased by this point. Some high-level takeaways here. Obviously, there was no upfront investment. Trader Joe's did not have to enter into a costly upfront capital agreement. They didn't owe anything upfront, and they could start saving money from day one. It's pretty low liability and maintenance obligations for them because they don't own it, because Regency owns the solar. They were much less at risk there. Generally speaking, the system has actually been much more productive than they were anticipating. So we're looking at a 10% more electricity that was produced than they had initially forecasted. So again, it goes to the bottom line and shows you how they may have calculated this all out, but at the end of the day, it actually factored in more effectively for them than they were anticipating. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about bringing energy efficiency into the actual lease process. So leasing is not necessarily the most exhilarating topic when you talk about buildings, but it is a really, really important component of energy efficiency and high-performing buildings, and one that you all as brokers should definitely keep in mind and be aware of. So who actually pays for efficiency? I will go through this slide pretty quickly because my guess is that you are pretty familiar with the different types of leases. Obviously, if we're looking at a full service gross lease, we're looking at the owner paying for core building operating and capital expenses and all of the like. When you go to the other side of the spectrum and you have a net lease, the tenant obviously is paying that base rent, operating costs, as it's been stipulated in the lease, but they may or may not be on the hook for any capital improvements. Modified gross, we have somewhere in the middle. Obviously, all of these conversations that we are discussing and all of these factors, energy efficiency factors, that go into a high performance building, it really matters what type of lease we are talking about. If we're talking about full service gross, it's a little bit of a different situation, but that's not to say that these upgrades are impossible for any type of lease. So you all are probably familiar with the split incentive problem. So as you see from this slide, whether you have the net lease, if you have the tenant who is paying the base rent and operating costs, but the landlord is the one who is on the hook for capital improvements, you're getting to this split incentive. There's no incentive for the tenant to make energy efficiency upgrades, but the landlord also feels disincentivized to make them if the tenant is the one who is paying for the operating costs. If they're the one paying the utility bills, why would they, the landlord, pay for an upgrade to make their building more efficient? Again, just breaking down what these capital expense pass-throughs could look like. You all are probably relatively familiar with this, so just to give you a snapshot of what some of these agreements look like. All right, so what does this look like in the real world? What is an example of how this is actually played out? So we're going back to Liberty Property Trust again. And Liberty Property Trust was actually a pretty early adopter of green leasing. They have been part of their leases since at least 2011. And they really view green leases as what they call future proofing. They want to set their buildings up to be as efficiently operating and as long-term sustainable, not just energy efficiency sustainable, but the building itself being very, very sustainable and long-term viable. What Liberty Property Trust has done here has delivered a pretty compelling argument for why tenants should enter into these agreements. Pretty cost neutral, and they're able to promote and show the business case to all of their tenants as to why this is not just going to be in Liberty Properties Trust interest, it's going to be in the tenant's interest. You can see down at the bottom here, you have deliver the green building tenants are paying for. So they're really giving them this premium luxury building. They're not just having them enter into a lease and it's a traditional building space. It is a premium luxury space, and they're giving them exactly what they're paying for. When you think about green leasing in general, you can think about it from the perspective of other regulations or guidelines or laws that have been put into place. A good example of this is ADA compliance. So when ADA compliance was first on the books, it was a pretty heavy lift for some businesses to be able to become compliant with those laws. But now it's almost a given. It is a given that ADA compliance is just something you have to adhere to. It's not debated. It's not something that really people blink an eye at. Green leasing, while it may still be new, is definitely on the up and up, and you're seeing more and more companies that are integrating green leasing into their practices. So this is another case study example from Brandywine Realty Trust. They again were, they were another company that was at the forefront of integrating green leases into their spaces. They are a full service gross lease company, so they do have some leverage that other companies may not, but that ends up really as a win-win for both them and their tenants. They're another example of a company that has integrated these green lease clauses into their contracts. So they are adjusting for the costs and the benefits of any energy efficiency improvement. But they have put a lot of effort into actually communicating those benefits to the tenant so that it's not a one-off upgrade that Brandywine does, but the tenant doesn't really quite understand what the benefit of it is. So communication is obviously a huge component when you are looking at green leasing. Leases may have used to have been very short, but today they are much longer. So communication of what the tenant is actually signing beyond just a legal jargon definition is definitely important. So we have one problem here, tenant buildouts. So you go through all of these processes that we've already discussed, and everything is happy and everything's great. But what about what happens when tenants build out? Landlords are under more pressure, increasingly more pressure to encourage these energy efficient build outs. But tenants tend to be wary of the upfront costs of a green building. Depending on how the building structure is set out, they may or may not really even care about the savings over the life of the lease. Depending on what their stipulations are, that may not even be something they factor in. On the flip side of that, landlords are also wary of making tenants do things to upgrade the space. You really just enter into this vicious cycle here where who is going to jump first? To give you an idea of why this problem is so significant, um, this breaks down end use of energy. Increasingly, um, end use plug loads, such as so things like printers and computers and cell phone chargers and those kinds of things, are rapidly increasing. They are rapidly the fastest growing energy usage component within a building's energy usage. So that obviously gets pinned on the tenant. I mean, a tenant can plug in 15 computers in a space that really should only support 5. So how do we fix this? If we are proving the business case across all the parties, so we looked at Brandywine a minute ago. Communication was first and foremost for them. They communicated the elements of why they were entering into a green lease and what that meant for all of the tenants, what that meant for them. We need to be communicating and providing the business case, not just for you as brokers, but for the landlords, for the tenants, building owners. You all as brokers, in some capacities, really are the gatekeepers to these transactions. You're on the front line. You're the first ones that conceivably could be entered into these conversations. So to set you all up in a more educated and a more knowledgeable position so that you feel confident talking about those, it will trickle down. And if you're able to confidently talk about these features and factor them into your business negotiations, that's going to benefit the entire sector. Using actual examples of market success. So feel free to refer back to this presentation, refer back to the examples we've given, refer back to the buildings that we've talked about. Realize that by using actual examples of how the market has been successful will only positively affect you in the long run. Be mindful of a build-out timeline. Oftentimes, tenants, landlords, building owners, they all operate under very different timelines, but being mindful of this will help make an energy efficiency upgrade more seamless and easier. Lastly, I encourage you to utilize existing resources. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Listening to this presentation is a fantastic first step, but I encourage you to revisit a lot of these slides, to revisit the resources that we're going over, and use them. Factor them in, save them on your computer, use them. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. A lot of folks have already been in your position, so I encourage you to use that to your advantage. So to give you an example of a pretty wild, drastic retrofit conversion, we have here a Class C warehouse building that was in Silicon Valley, California. And the developer bought this building and was intending to take it from a Class C, not so great warehouse building, and he wanted to make it into a net zero office space. So if you think about the spectrum, he went from one end of the spectrum all the way to the other end. This doesn't necessarily represent a classic example. It's a pretty romanticized one, but very realistic nonetheless. This is not necessarily an example that you would pull from if you're just looking to save a few $1,000s on your energy use. However, know that taking a building from bottom of the line all the way up to the top is very, very doable. There is a cost premium, of course. You're probably not surprised by that. The development company we're talking about here is Sharp Development Company, just to place you all if you are familiar with the company. There was roughly a $50 square foot difference in the cost from taking from a code compliant, so the minimum, all the way to a sustainable net zero building. So there's $50 per square foot cost premium that we were looking at. However, if you look, and this is uh, towards the top of the page over to the right, there was a over $200,000 uh, annual rent net of operating expenses. That's pretty substantial. I mean, if you look at the numbers from the code compliant building, we're looking at in the 800,000s. We're looking at over $1 million in sustainable net zero building. That's a pretty substantial, sizable amount of money. The really cool part about this specific warehouse was it was getting developed. The developer was coming in and upgrading it and changing it to net zero, making all these really fantastic changes. But he was really struggling to find financing. So he had these grand plans to come in and make all these changes, but no bank really quite understood what his goal was. So he really, really struggled. He did eventually end up finding financing, and the best part was that even before the renovations were done, he had a tenant come in, look at the building, was incredibly interested in it, moved in before the construction was done. Factors into his bottom line at the end of the day. He had somebody who moved in before he was even factoring in. He was making money months before he had anticipated to in this building. More so than that, after this building was done and the tenant was moved in, he turned around and moved down to the next Class C warehouse building in the same neighborhood. Updated that one as well, turned it into a net zero space as well. Tenant moved in before the construction was done. You see a trend here. Tenants are requesting and interested in these net zero buildings. So we've talked a little bit about build outs in general and what factors can go into it. And when we looked at what the specific upgrades are, that gave you an idea of what some of the concrete actions you can take are, or what the concrete retrofits can be. But landlords can also require efficient tenant build outs. So we were talking a little bit about lease clauses a minute ago, and we're going to go a little bit more into that now. But know that it doesn't just have to be the tenant who is at the helm of these discussions. The landlord can also require these efficient build-outs. So a really classic example is the Empire State Building. So the Empire State Building went through a fairly substantial energy efficiency upgrade. This case study specifically for the energy or the Empire State Building has been focus of a number of sustainability case studies since it has been done. So you may have heard about this one before. But basically this was a $20 million project roughly. And what ended up happening after all of these improvements were made was that the greenhouse gas emissions were cut by a third. More so than that, they cut millions off of the Empire State Building's utility costs. Now, obviously, it's a pretty large building, but we're talking millions that were cut off the utility bills for that building. What they ended up doing was following what is now known as the Urban Land Institute's 10-step process. So it's a free and open program. It's returns driven. It's 10 steps. It breaks it all down. It has been piloted in a number of tenant fit outs. And payback period tends to be 3 to 5 years. Energy savings, we're looking at 30 to 50%. It's a pretty substantial and well supported process. This breaks down what those steps are. So we have all the way up from use a broker with experience in sustainability down to that communication element again. Perform ongoing reporting. So all of these are factors you've heard during the scope of this presentation. But note that this really starts with you all. As a broker, selecting a team or having your client select you as a team really sets everybody up for a win-win long term. As the gatekeepers of these transactions, you need to be aware of what opportunities are out there and what building upgrades exist. So you can learn more if you're interested in learning more about Urban Land Institute, ULI's 10-step process. You can go to tenantenergy.uli.org. There's a number of resources that exist there. There's also a value analysis tool, some really great tools and resources that I would definitely recommend writing down if you are interested in this or how many clients that you think might be able to fit into this category. All right, so energy aligned leasing. We've talked a little bit, and I've hit on a few times about this element of green or high performance leasing, or how it can be factored into the lease contracts with tenants and landlords and whatnot. But now we're going to actually really get into what it is. So quite literally, what is a green lease? What is an energy line lease? It can either be an addendum or a full revamped lease. We frequently see participants making an addendum rather than completely updating and editing their lease. At its core, it's really just adding high performance, energy efficiency, energy aligned, whatever synonym you choose, clauses into these tenant agreements. So you will operate the HVAC at X temperature setting. You will retrocommission the HVAC at X number of years or months. It sets out really any stipulation that you can think of for any of the building operations and maintenance and sets those expectations and guidelines, but in a lease format. So that it is signed, agreed upon, negotiation is done, and you don't need to then revisit this negotiation every time there's a build out or an upgrade. It alleviates the need or most of the need for that negotiation. That's not to say that there won't be any negotiation, but it's setting a baseline and a benchmark for the typical agreed upon mechanisms and settings and stipulations so that it's alleviating a lot of the work down the line. So what you have here, don't worry about reading every last word here, but these are some examples of lease clauses. So specifically in the sharing utility data. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about technology that data sharing is huge. Without data transparency, either from your landlord, you as a tenant, or utility to customer, whatever it is, without that transparency, it's difficult to figure out what the best and most efficient or most important efficiency upgrades are going to be. So definitely revisit this slide. These are some great actual lease clauses that have been used. Just to give you an example, you have tenant shall provide within 10 days after landlord's request from time to time reasonably requested energy and water consumption data. You have a requirement for LEED certification. These are all factors that can be looped into leases. And by putting these clauses in, you're making your lease from a traditional lease to a green lease. Some other areas that clauses can show up, that high performance clauses can show up, are daytime cleaning, costs and benefits. You can take a green lease down to as specific as what cleaning products are used. So when the cleaning crew comes in, how frequently are they there? What are they cleaning? What products are they using? Are they sustainable? Are they, a certain chemical free? You can get as specific as you want, or you can keep it as broad as you want. You can keep it to building operating hours and limiting HVAC use on the nights and weekends. You can also write into that clause that if tenants need HVAC use on the nights or weekends that they are charged a certain premium. So these are all things that conceivably can show up in your typical green lease. So if you're really interested in this, I would definitely recommend looking at IMT's program Green Lease Leaders. This is a DOE partnership. IMT runs the Green Lease Leaders Recognition Program. Every year we recognize more companies for their excellence in green lease clauses and how they have used these green leases to help overcome that split incentive we were talking a minute ago about. To date, over 1 billion square feet has been recognized by our program. And we have awarded something to the like of over 30 companies for Green Lease Leaders. And again, this is every year, so I would definitely recommend looking at it. Green Lease Leaders, greenleaseleaders.com is the website. You have 30 companies that own or manage 1 billion square feet that have been recognized by this program. So you have companies like Kimco, you have Regency Centers who we've talked about, Boston Properties, all pretty big names. There is no size differentiation between a green lease leader and a non-green lease leader. You can come from a large or small company. You just have to meet those green lease stipulations. Kimco Realty is actually a great example of a company who is offering, has moved to offering, instead of, for example, a vanilla shell, they offer a green box. So their green box offering sets their tenants up for more efficient spaces. So sustainably minded, energy efficient spaces, you can request a green box. If you're interested, there is also a team transaction for green lease leaders. So brokers, landlords, tenants, if you have a team that you would like to enter, that is also an opportunity. So here we have another case study example, getting into a little bit more about some of those realistic upgrades, or real world upgrades, we should say. This is again in New York. This is Cushman & Wakefield's office. It's a much smaller project than we have seen before. Their lease term, we're looking at 10 years. But if you go over to the right in that box there, their energy reduction, we're looking at almost 50% of energy reduction. If you look down at what are the ECM, so the energy conservation measures that they implemented, some pretty cool stuff. I mean, they had your typical LED lighting, but they also had daylight harvesting. They had really high efficiency HVAC and motors. Their server power management was improved. The office temperature set point was increased. So if you work in an office where you are always shivering, always cold, always need a sweater, that's noteworthy. And their server room, they did a lot of server room upgrades as well. When you look at the payback and what the payback period was with utility incentives, you're looking at less than 2 years, so pretty substantial. Here's an example of some of the daylight harvesting that was done. So you've got, daylight streaming in, some really high-tech space, really just an overall satisfying space. So you're increasingly seeing a lot of these buildings that use technology and natural daylight to really interact and make it a much more efficient and enjoyable space to be in. I was actually out in Seattle, Washington a few years ago doing some work with the Gates Foundation, so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. One of my favorite memories from that trip was how a colleague of mine was giving a presentation, and halfway through his presentation, all of a sudden we're sitting there and the shades and the blinds just start moving down. I was taken aback. I didn't really quite understand what was going on until one of the employees there explained to me that their building is so efficient and so technologically advanced that they have mechanical shades and window blinds that move based on the weather outside, the direction of sunlight, the time of day, whether it's daylight savings time. I mean, these windows are smarter than your average person. They are incredibly intelligent. They have utilized technology in such a manner that takes pretty normal factors. So when does the sun set? When does the sun rise? But use it to their advantage. So if the sun is too glaring, those shades go down. Then the HVAC doesn't have to cool the space as aggressively. It doesn't need to be set to a temperature set point in order to cool the space. So pretty cool stuff that's going on. Not all of us can be the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but there are some lessons that we can pick up along the way. So what are some common barriers here? I mean, we've talked about all the really great stuff that's going on. We've talked about, awesome things that are going on with all of these spaces, but what are some common barriers? Unfamiliarity with green lease terms. That's a huge one. Green leasing is still pretty new in the grand scheme of things. People are not terribly familiar with it unless you are on the front line in this industry. So anything that's unfamiliar has an uphill battle to climb often. There's a steep learning curve. More so than that, there's a fear of build-out cost overrun. So there is always that concern. When you set out for an energy efficiency improvement, you might overrun. You might have a more expensive build-out than you were expecting, which you can argue is a pretty normal concern in any build out, but there is an increased concern of that when we're talking about high performance build outs. Lastly, unfamiliarity with these high performance building standards. So maybe at the beginning of this webinar, you really didn't know too much about LEED or Energy Star, and that's fine. But the ability to integrate that into your daily vocabulary, into your daily business negotiations and proceedings is huge. It's really significant. So it's encouraging that more brokers are taking this course and more brokers are taking the time to familiarize themselves with what is LEED, what is Energy Star, because general unfamiliarity with these topics can cause some rift down the line. It's sets you up if you and your client are educated on these topics. All right, so now we are going to get into some valuation and funding issues. If you are a numbers and financial person, you will love this. This is going to be some resources and statistics and data and stuff that you can use down the line. A lot of these resources are ones that I would recommend writing down and revisiting after this presentation. So, I keep saying that brokers are the gatekeepers, and that's true. And you all are often on the front line of these business transactions, and you are the liaison to a lot of landlords, tenants, building owners, whoever it may be. But we really have to get appraisal right as well. So you can do your job as a broker. You can close a fantastic deal, but if the appraisal of the building isn't really quite what it should be, or if the appraiser doesn't realize the benefit of an energy efficient building, there's not really much that you can do. So we really have to speak to the importance of integrating energy efficiency and high performance characteristics into building appraisal. So don't be afraid if you interact with appraisers on your daily interactions. Don't be afraid to point them towards these resources, to be an education source for them. Don't be afraid to educate them on some of these characteristics, LEED, Energy Star, the value of EMS or more efficient HVACs. I mean, don't be afraid to be the educator on those. So here are some resources to get you started. We have for owners and for lenders. These were created with the Appraisal Institute and the Institute for Market Transformation. So we have green building and property value and high performance buildings and property value. I would definitely recommend looking into these and pointing any clients towards these resources if they would find them beneficial. So with the Appraisals Foundation also has a number of resources in conjunction with Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory that I would definitely recommend looking into. They are one of the industry leaders in these topics. There's a valuation guide that really breaks down specifically what the true value of green and high performance property characteristics are. It provides a really great core background education for anybody who works in that realm, either an appraiser or someone who's just interested in educating themselves on these valuation topics. So the Appraisal Institute and IMT have worked on a number of courses together, as well as some additional resources. So I would definitely encourage you to go to appraisalinstitute.org. What you will also find is that there's a registry of appraisers, so green, energy efficient appraisers who are aware of these types of characteristics. I would definitely encourage you to look into that a bit more if you find that this is a gap in your business proceedings. So we're going to talk a little bit about financing right now. These are some examples of financial vehicles. So beyond building appraisal, I mean, the building appraisal is going to be, the building is going to be appraised at the level that it is. Regardless of what that number ends up being, there are still vehicles that you can use to finance energy efficiency. What you see up on the screen here, there are a few examples, and we'll get into a few others. I would encourage you also to look into non-private companies such as PACE, so that's Property Assessed Clean Energy. They have CPACE for commercial buildings. I would definitely encourage you to look into those. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation, but in essence, you are looping the costs of energy efficiency upgrades into the actual life of the building. So the cost could conceivably be passed from mortgage to mortgage. So it is integrated into the building itself rather than being an upfront cost. So I would encourage you to look at a whole number of different financing mechanisms. So even though we've primarily been focusing on commercial sector, it is important to mention Fannie Mae. Fannie Mae is obviously a leading name in the financial industry, and their Green Rewards program specifically is one that can be looked to as a success story. It's available to multifamily properties nationwide. You can utilize this program if you are going through refinance, acquisition. It doesn't matter at what stage you are. But basically, the bottom line for this Green Awards is that you must be able to commit and show a property's annual or energy or water reduction by 20%. You are entitled to an energy audit, which will determine what those ECMs, energy conservation measures, are going to be that you could conceivably use. Once you get that energy audit, as long as you can document, and I believe you have something like 12 months in order to implement those ECMs into your building and to demonstrate that energy savings, you get additional loan proceeds. So it's up to 5 basis points is usually what it is. So definitely look into it if there's any multifamily buildings in your portfolio. All right, so in the home stretch here, I want to talk a little bit more about some additional resources that exist out there. We've mentioned in some of those case studies, you have heard, well, if there was utility incentives, then the cost to the building owner actually was $10,000 less or $8,000 less or whatever it was. Desire USA is a really great database that you can go to look for those utility incentives. It doesn't have 100% of them, so I would definitely recommend also checking in with your local utility if there's something that you're particularly interested in. But it lists all sorts of incentives, so natural gas, solar, I mean, you name it. It's a pretty good database to start with. And utility incentives are an incredibly important measure to factor in when you are looking at energy efficiency upgrades. A project that could cost you 20 grand straight off your bat, you could potentially save thousands of dollars depending on what that project is if you utilize the incentives that your utility offers. So don't rule out your utility when you are thinking about these programs or these upgrades or how they factor into your programs. Definitely keep it in mind. So I mentioned way back at the beginning how Energy Star is typically what benchmarking laws and guidelines look to. What we have here is a map that was put together by the Institute for Market Transformation, and it shows you where across the country benchmarking and transparency policies are popping up. So you can see you have some states that this is already implemented, and then you have more cities that it's a citywide jurisdiction. So California and New York City, for example, are two examples of jurisdictions that are increasingly looking to benchmarking. California, you can kind of assume will be at the forefront of these conversations, but you're seeing more cities, and it's not just on the coast, as we said. So when we were looking at the high performance building maps from across the country, we were seeing that it's not just East Coast, West Coast major metropolitan cities. I mean, it's all over. You have Kansas City, St. Louis, Denver, Boulder, Oklahoma. I mean, you name it. Look at this map and definitely, if you find yourself in one of these cities or states, I would definitely ensure that you are fairly educated on these high performance building characteristics. If you haven't already seen them in your day-to-day, you definitely will. And this map is only increasing in scope of states and jurisdiction that it covers. So definitely keep it in mind, especially if you are in one of these cities. Another resource that I would recommend you visit is the Greenlease Library. Greenlease Library is hosted by IMT, and there are a plethora of Greenlease resources. It can point you towards a whole lot of resources that can get you started on your Greenlease journey. If you are interested in applying for Greenlease leaders, this is also a great place to start. Maybe your building is not quite at a Greenlease leader state just yet. You can't quite check off all the boxes, but you are almost there. Greenlease Library will have a number of Greenlease clauses and resources and infographics that you can use to push your building over into that Greenlease leader level. All right, so that has been a lot. I have thrown a lot of topics at you. We have talked about a whole number of characteristics. What makes a building high performance? What makes it green? Why is this worthwhile? So the next two slides are really quick, down and dirty, high performance buildings 101. So we talked about how 40% of the nation's energy consumption comes from residential and commercial buildings. We talked about how these green properties, in comparison and contrast to that, can have a 30% increase in NOI and an 18% reduction in operating expenses. So when you're looking at 40% of the energy consumption coming from a certain sector, you really want to see how you can make that more worth your while from a business case standpoint. Lead and Energy Star are on a rapid upward trend. They're not going away. Doesn't matter where you are in the country. These are trends that you can't ignore. Knowing about high performance buildings and what characteristics is encompassed in a high performance building gives you as a broker a competitive edge. Competition is huge in any business, and knowing these characteristics makes you more competitive. CSR and technology are rapidly driving the market. More and more companies are reporting on their sustainability, and you as a broker would benefit from knowing not only who those companies are, but knowing that this trend is not going away. Additionally, we know that technology is only making all of these trends easier and quicker on the uptake. We broke down a lot of the different specific energy conservation measures. So we looked at solar, we looked at retrocommissioning, low flow faucets, you name it. They're available at all price points. This isn't a one size fits all. You don't need to just upgrade to LED lighting. That's not the only upgrade that is available. You can go all the way up to solar. You can do a green roof. You can get an Energy Star appliance. There's really a number of conservation measures, and they're at a ton of different price points. Lastly, we talked about green leasing. Green leasing can help facilitate retrofits and remove the split incentive. If you can build and fold these components into your contractual lease negotiations, you set yourself up to be in a win-win situation down the line and continually win-win. It's not a one and done document. You can fold these characteristics into a green lease, negotiate it at the time, and when tenants want to build out, when there are conversations like that down the line, you know that the negotiation has already been done. You've already done that big chunk of the work. So thank you all for your interest and your participation in this presentation. I hope you got something from it. More so than anything, I hope you have been able to take away that there is a real business case for high performance buildings. The business case is there, the numbers are there. As brokers, I encourage you to educate yourself on any of these components that you might want to learn more about, or as we were going through, you weren't quite confident on. Definitely reach out to IMT, www.imt.org. We have a slew of resources that were not mentioned on this presentation that we can point you towards. We have a number of resident experts in-house who can help you out, and a number of our programs will help you and your clients as well. So I encourage you to take this information with you as you go out and learn how you can incorporate high-performance buildings into your business day-to-day interactions and negotiations. Thank you for your time.